Hello, this is Valerie Moore from the Frederian Gazette. We hope you weren't caught in this evening's rainstorm, and you're somewhere warm and comfortable as you listen to our reenactment of the controversial book, Say I Sue Them Not. Written by Kingsley, edited by Alexander Phillips, and narrated by Pepper Holloway. If you've enjoyed our program so far and want to support independent journalism, please donate to our Ko-Fi at www.ko-fi.com/The Frederian Gazette. Content warnings for this episode include colonial violence, police brutality and violence, mass death, torture, imprisonment, solitary confinement, and trauma. This program has been sponsored by Billy's Tattoo, Piercing, and Carving Parlor. Why trust an amateur to take a needle to your skin when you can have Billy create a masterpiece on your body? Today we have a treat for you. Today we will be playing the original recording of Alexander Phillips' interview with Devin Tossier.
Good evening. This is Frederian Gazette's Evening News. I am Chester Fairview, joining you from Berkassa, Hiva. Today we'll start with Frederian Gazette reporter Alexander Phillips and a special guest who promises to provide a unique perspective on the ongoing Montevello trial. Alex? Thank you, Chester. I am sitting here with Frederian Senator Devin Tossier. Hello, Senator. It's a pleasure to have you on the air. Thank you, Alex. A pleasure to be here. Before Senator Tossier joined the Frederian Congress, he was a member of the Ilkhatal Liberation Army and fought alongside the likes of Siegfried von Holt, Carrie McNair, and Kingsley Montevello. Senator, our listeners are very familiar with Kingsley's story, but can you talk about your experience with the ILA? Honestly, the only reason I joined was because Gary rescued me from a very angry wife, and I figured I owed him one. When I joined, it was just Heron, Sid, Gary, and Sandy. Asia wanted to join, but Sandy was on the fence. He needed her to help run the business, which was mostly smuggling and occasionally bank robbing. I dragged Ernest to an ILA meeting because of a miscommunication. I thought it was a date, and Z thought I simply needed Zier to pay for dinner. You can ask my wife. I'm terrible with money. Did you often bring your dates to ILA meetings? No, but it made sense at the time. Asia was there that night. Can't remember if Sandy finally caved or if she was there because no one could stop her. Ernest fell for her hard. Kingsley joined a year or two later. Many question Kingsley's actual role in the ILA. Can you clarify what role he played? Kingsley was a kid when he joined. I know our concept of age doesn't match the Hevians or Frederians' idea of age, but I think most beings would agree that 15 is young. There are things you don't ask a 15-year-old to do, such as, for example, Kingsley was only a lookout during the disastrous bombing of the archives. He was also a lookout when Ernest killed the chief inspector. He was supposed to tell Sig and the others when the police chief's carriage came into view, and then get the hell out of there. Maybe he stayed to watch the assassination, but he didn't actively take part in it. He was heavily involved in my rescue, though. That's true. At that point, we had to rely on everyone because the three of us were in jail, and he was older and more experienced then. But we all were. If Kingsley was only tangentially involved until at least 1828, can we trust any of his memoir? For example, he writes quite a visceral description of Griffin's tenure in Berkassa. Is any of that true? Kingsley distorts a lot in the past, but he doesn't lie when it comes to Hevians. I don't like to hold grudges, but Griffin... I don't think I can say what I'm thinking on air. Griffin was worse than the demons. I mean, a demon can't help it, but Griffin? Her cruelty was deliberate. She could have chose a different path, but she used her position to be as sadistic as possible. She burnt houses with Ilkhatal trapped inside, she arrested random Ilkhatal and dumped their tortured bodies in the streets. Most of them were dead by the time she was through with them. Asia was one of the quote-unquote lucky few who survived. The timing of Asia's attack is interesting, considering the falling out between Ernest and Siegfried. Can you clarify what actually happened? Kingsley simplified a very complicated argument we core members of the ILA were having. Unlike the IFM, we didn't know what war to fight or how. Heron resurrected the ILA because Sig and Gary randomly picked fight with Hevians just to fight. Heron wanted to channel that reckless energy into something productive. The others joined at a trickle, and things grew complicated. Heron himself was torn between engaging in open warfare with the Hevians and fighting through transformative and nonviolent means. That's the approach Amy and I always took. Claiming our right to exist is as revolutionary as throwing a bomb into a grocery store. Caring for each other, providing the services our governments refuse to provide, investing in the future, believing and proclaiming we have a future is world-shattering. Sid, Gary, and Kingsley didn't see things that way. They believed in direct action and violent revolution. That's how Marcus did it in Tobraga to seemingly great success. By the time we realized the only way to survive was by utilizing both approaches, it was too late. Heron was kicked out of the ILA, and Siegfried led my friends to the slaughter. Did Ernest leave the ILA over Siegfried's leadership? Ernest left the ILA because Siegfried was reckless and didn't bother to check his own work. I think you called it out in the chapter, but we never intended to blow up the archives. We wanted to hurt the police. Ernest frequently called Siegfried out, but it was easier to isolate Ernest because Z was an unusually educated Ilkhatal who worked in the Hevian bank and spoke Hevian better than Ilkhali. Z wasn't a quote-unquote proper revolutionary.
So it was easy to dismiss your concerns. Exactly. Even though most of us had the same concerns. And Ernest wasn't a coward. Z committed everything Z had to the cause. Z just defined the cause differently than Kingsley and Siegfried. You claim that Kingsley lied about who took over for Heron. Can you tell us what really happened? Heron's decision to step down shocked us all, even though we should have seen it coming. Siegfried worked on us all, trying to convince us that Heron was too broken. Heron told me Siegfried threatened civil war if he didn't resign, and at the time, Heron couldn't be certain if Siegfried was bluffing or not. Better to keep the ILA intact and focused on fighting for independence than fighting with each other. Heron always put the cause first. At the time, we had like 10 members, so he must have figured there was only so much damage Sid could cause by himself. We argued after Heron's announcement, but we eventually decided to vote on Heron's replacement. Like I said before, Kingsley was only 15, maybe 16 at that point. He wasn't considered for any leadership position, let alone as Sid's second-in-command and successor. That came later, after Siegfried's day, and we didn't have any other option. Why do you think Kingsley lied? It's not a full-out lie, is it? There was a growing schism. Heron was angry about the archive bombings. Siegfried forced him to step down, and we took a vote. Kingsley just changed minor details and threw Ernest and me under the bus. Regarding who ended up being Siegfried's successor, well, that's not really a lie either. It just happened later. I want to circle back to the IFM. In one of Kingsley's recent chapters, he claims that the IFM was only interested in consolidation, not a partnership. Was that your understanding as well? Again, it was far more complicated than that. See, Sid could inspire, but Marcus could lead. I remember when Marcus walked into that first meeting with Sean and Margaret flanking him, like the Verassian guards. It was like he could crumble mountains with a glance. Even Sandy was impressed, although he warned Siegfried we could kiss our autonomy goodbye. So Kingsley wasn't being paranoid then. The IFM wanted to subsume the ILA. Looking back at it all, we must have seemed so naive to Marcus and the others. The ILA was a nascent organization that punched far harder than it had any right to, mostly because Sid was reckless. I worked my ass off to recruit, but we never reached the membership or professionalism of the IFM, and they knew it, even if we never wanted to admit it to ourselves. So they wanted to take over the ILA before you could threaten their own operations. That's how Carrie thought. Marcus was ambivalent about it. He saw it as a chance to groom and grow a new cadre of officers who could strike at the heart of Hiva's capital. Whether we were formal members of the IFM or just their allies didn't seem to matter to him. But Carrie wanted the ILA to report to the IFM. Carrie was a professional, and he was unforgiving to anyone who didn't meet his exacting standards. He thought having two separate Ilkhatal freedom movements making demands of the Hevians would only confuse things, especially if one group accepted terms the other group didn't. Carrie sent Margaret specifically to assess how easy it would be to either dismantle us or integrate with us. Not that Margaret had much time between Sean's arrest and Siegfried's day. Yes, Kingsley glosses over your actual experience while in jail. Are you willing to talk about what conditions were like for you, Ernest, and Sean? I was wondering when we'd get to that. If it's too... No. It needs to be discussed because very little has changed since then. We were arrested.
the night we met Marcus. The cops grabbed me as I tried to run and slammed my head against the pavement, so the arrest itself is still a bit blurry. Ernest and Sean were arrested as well, and we were taken to a local jailhouse. I just remembered. They tried to take our fingerprints. Ilkhatal don't have any. But the cops stuck our fingers in the ink and pressed it against the paper. They must have tried 10 times before giving up. The ignorance of Hevians. What happened next? I met Quentin. He was charged for being a nuisance. As usual. Yeah. He's one of the bravest people I know. He was in our cell. I think the Hevians forgot about him. Anyway, we made a deal. If he could smuggle a message to Amy about our predicament, we'd arrange an interview with Siegfried. I knew Amy would find a way to get our message to Sid. The next morning, the Hevians moved us to Holloway. No, Wilson? It was either Wilson or Holloway Penitentiary. The worst place for an Ilkhatal. How long were you there? No more than a few months, I think. The first night, that was the worst. They tried that game, where one cop is kind and the other one beats you to near death, and then the kind cop, quote unquote, saves you. I don't know why they bothered. I barely remember what offer, if any, they made. Just extreme pain. They treated Sean and Ernest the same way, although they must have put up more of a fight because they looked rougher than I did. I remember that. What did they hope to achieve by torturing you? God knows. They probably were bored, and we were Ilkhatal. They never needed a reason. How long did the beatings last? Oh, for months. It didn't stop Sean from organizing the entire prison, though. First, we had to organize the Ilkhatal prisoners, which wasn't hard. The Indariums joined us because we offered protection from the Hevian prisoners. The Minotaurs were planning their own riots and wanted to make sure we didn't get in their way. The Hevians predictably resisted us, but they realized they couldn't overpower us, so they joined our side as well. Sean was the main organizer of the riots, and he took Ernest under his wing. Sean was completely ruthless and had a singular focus, and Ernest had changed so much after Griffin's forces attacked Asia, and prison just solidified that change. I almost didn't recognize Zir. Z learned what it was to be an effective rebel leader, I guess. I don't think it really changed Siegfried's thought about Zir, though. First, we refused to work as slaves for the state. The police tried to stop us, but we rioted. I have to be honest, I don't remember much of this time period. It was hard. It was really hard. I don't like to think about it. That's alright, I understand. Sean kept us focused, and Ernest was our connection with the Minotaurs and Indariums. Sean even made a list of demands and handed it to the Hevians interrogating him. Can you imagine that? Going to an interrogation and handing the interrogator a list of demands. That Ilkhatal had a nerve of steel. What sort of demands? We wanted to be released, but would settle for special status since many of us didn't know what our actual charges were. Sean argued that because we were sentenced, Ernest, Sean, and I were sentenced with a judge or jury, we weren't criminal prisoners. We requested to be exempt from prison work, allowed to wear our own clothes, and to have free time so we could organize educational and recreational pursuits, and to receive one visit and one letter or parcel undisturbed per week. Were any of the demands granted? No. Of course not. Just more beatings. And when that failed, the Hevians tried solitary confinement. All three of us were locked in tight rooms for days at a time. I think Sean had the longest streak. It must have been 3-4 weeks at once. Ernest and I tried to keep up the protest in his absence, and it got bad. The Hevians killed a few of the prisoners during a riot. At that point, they shipped us off to another prison. I don't remember which one. There were so many. They all blur into one after a while. Either the second or third prison, we went on mess strike. What's a mess strike? It's when we refused to bathe or go to the lavatories. The cops would beat us every time we needed to use the restroom, so we just decided to stay. It was less painful that way, in some cases. We threw our shit on the walls and prevented the guards from cleaning it. Doesn't that hurt you more than the cops? The cops passed by our cells every day. They fought with us to get us to work. We still had to eat and work for the state. And they were pressured by the warden to control us. You know, having shit on the walls, pretty decent sign that you've lost control of your prison. But yeah, no, it hurt us more than it hurt them. I don't think you can understand the horror of living in the middle of your own filth, unable to leave, unable to do anything to distract yourself. Just hours and days, and it's odd, but one sense of self can depend on nothing more than a bar of soap and warm water. Another beating before we were shipped off again. It didn't matter though. Everywhere we went, we connected with other prisoners. We updated our demands depending on what our fellow prisoners wanted, and we organized. It's amazing how well Marcus and Carrie trained their people. Sean was effective, ruthless, and intelligent, while the Hevians grew more and more desperate. At some point, Amy organized protests outside the prisons, and we could hear them occasionally. That was great. Um, Amy's my wife, so I'm a little biased, but she's amazing. The way she was able to organize that and never let up, even when we were released. She kept fighting for other prisoners to be released. That helped a lot. Um, yeah, that was helpful. It's amazing, you're doing solitary confinement for a few weeks, you hear nothing, and then you walk out and you hear, it's faint, but you can hear it, all these voices calling for you, telling you not to give up. Yeah, I'm sorry. I wandered off there for a little bit. I think it was either the fourth or fifth prison when the Hevians broke Ernest's kneecap and Sean's hands. Maybe when I lost my vision in this eye as well. I can't remember really when that happened. I remember being scared about needing a glass eye. I worried about the expense because I knew I'd constantly lose it, and I do. I have a whole set of glass eyes, and I think I lose half of them in like a week. I think we met Frank in the fifth prison as well. Frank, one of the most wanted criminals in all of Hiva and Kilbaraga. She was one of Sandy's associates, who we had done business with before. She protected us from the cops. She bought most of them, although there were a few cops who liked to cause trouble. Kingsley writes that you had a close relationship with Frank. Yeah, well, while in prison, you get bored. No, I shouldn't be so flippant. We dated. It wasn't merely to survive. I really liked her. Although we never would have worked. Frank often butted heads with Sean and Ernest. They worked things out by mostly staying away from each other and not interfering with each other's plans. I was a mediator between Sean and Frank while Ernest organized the other prisoners. The cops in this prison were more hesitant to attack us until the last few weeks. By then, our sentence, including Frank's, had been changed to execution. I don't know why it took the Hevians so long. You had mentioned this earlier, but Kingsley claims that Amy led several protests outside the prison calling for your release. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Of course, I can talk about that all day. My God, Amy. Amy's always been amazing. Like I said, she's my wife, so some bias there, but it helped of our own attempts to organize. It really did. The other prisoners knew we had people on the outside willing to fight for us, and so they knew we weren't bullshitting or causing trouble just to cause trouble. When you're in a prison, your rights are dependent on what the officer allows you to have. And if you upset the system, even if you know the system is bad and the system is just going to hurt you anyway, those little rights you have, like I said, the bar of soap and water can be the difference between surviving another day and just dying. And so it made sense they wouldn't want us causing trouble just to cause trouble. That doesn't help anyone. When we told them we'd fight for them, they knew we meant it because of Amy. Amy, Ernest, Sean, Margaret, and I, we kept in touch with several prisoners and worked hard on the side to get them released or get them things they needed. We actually got a few hopeless cases released and helped a dozen other prisoners still stuck in prison. We would expand our program after Siegfried's Day. According to Quentin, the public outcry grew louder after he leaked details about the prison riots. Of course he did. I don't know how he's avoided arrest and execution all these years. I think I remember Kings mentioning that to me. Huge protests, some even including Hevians, and the embarrassment over the fact that Hiva's entire police force couldn't subdue 3 difficult Ilkhatal. Honestly, I'm surprised they didn't sneak Griffin back over the border to kill us, although by then I think she was recovering from Marcus's assassination attempt. One of many. Yeah, that woman didn't know how to die. After the rescue, the ILA focused on planning for Siegfried's Day. Could you share what the ILA hoped to achieve on that day? Oh, yeah. Siegfried's Day was suicide. I recognize that now. Margaret and Sean called Sig out on it, but they were interlopers at the time. Even though we drew close while in prison or planning the rescue, you know how it can get. Sometimes close-knit groups will hold strangers at arm's length, especially when challenged. The goal was to force legislative action. The Hevians had relied on their military both in Hiva and Braga, and it wasn't working. We figured a large, organized mass protest that spanned several cities throughout Hiva would force Smith, who was president at the time, to do something, anything, to address our many demands. Asia and I worked day and night spreading the word, recruiting whoever we could, while Gary gathered weapons, and Siegfried went on a speaking tour to keep people angry. And then Sean shared with me intelligence reports he received either from Terry or Frank or any of their other sources, and it became clear that the Hevians were going to respond brutally to our protest. By then, Sean and Margaret were effectively iced out, so I brought the report to Sig. I think I had broken my leg by then during a stupid escape from the Hevian police. I must have looked ridiculous, crutching to him with Sean's information in hand, begging him to call it off. He refused. He truly believed that the Hevian people, regular civilians, would be outraged if a handful of Ilkhatal died in Founders Square. Just one public massacre, and we'd be free. I don't know why. They killed us before, and it never mattered. I'm sorry, Dev. I didn't do enough. I fought with everyone. Kings, Gary, even Ernest. I went to Sandy, and he shrugged and said joining the ILA had always been suicide, one way or another. Kind of true, but, this was different. This was purposeful. Siegfried knew. I stopped promoting the event, but the damage was done. I watched Gary and Kingsley leave, neither talking to me. And I knew I was never going to see my friends again. Thank you, Devin, for sharing that with us. I feel ashamed to trouble you with one more question. Go ahead, it's why I'm here. What is your opinion on Kingsley's trial? I assume you've been listening to our updates. I feel like I have to say yes or you won't invite me back. Regarding the trial itself, it's a mistake. When the Fairway trials were conducted immediately after the war, the organizers, they took the time to discuss the scope and goals of those trials. They knew exactly what they were risking and what they would hope would be gained. The International Court hasn't done the same for Kingsley's trial. I'm an abolitionist. My life's purpose is to resist the carceral and imperialistic mindset that makes beings like Kingsley, and even myself, necessary. Have I hurt and killed people in the past? Yes. Do I believe we have to continue to kill people to survive? No. And a lot of people get upset when I say that. They accost me and say, didn't you used to support violence? Like it's a candidate running for president. They ask me, why are you people so violent? How can you preach peace and nonviolence now after what you've done? No one ever asks, why is the state violent? I was born in Verdun, and I traveled to Berkassa because I was answering my homeland's call. The first few weeks I was in Berkassa, I lived with a mail carrier. Very nice at Ilkhatal. My third week with him, the mail carriers went on strike. They wanted a 5-cent increase in pay. 5 cents. And 1 day off, because non-Hevians weren't allowed to have the holy day off. That was God's day, and only true crossnits, i.e. Hevians, could rest with God. The rest of us had to work because we were sinners. The mail carriers weren't associated with the ILA or the IFM. They were just a group of workers who wanted to be treated better. The strike went on for weeks, and workers struggled to survive. they instituted communal dinners, and at first it was just the 20 or so carriers bringing whatever they could. But soon it grew to encompass several blocks of Ilkhatal who couldn't make ends meet on their own. They weren't even involved with the strike, but they needed help. And so they came to these dinners because maybe they could survive one more day if they relied on each other. I went to a few with my roommate, and it was fun. It was peaceful. It was just a bunch of poor Ilkhatal sharing food and stories. One night, 50 cops cordoned off the dinner and opened fire. They killed 7 people, including 2 small children, and they wounded dozens more. The strikers moved the location of the dinner, and the cops found them, and the same thing would happen over and over again until the strikers had to stop dinners. Without the dinners, they couldn't keep up the strike, so they returned to work, but their employer fired them on the spot, and they were blacklisted. I don't know how many died from starvation and destitution. It's moments like that. Why? Why did the Hevians respond so violently? What was so dangerous about Ilkhatal eating together? This trial feels similarly thoughtless and violent. There are 100 different ways Kingsley could be held responsible for his actions while healing our various communities. There are 100 different ways to address the trauma of the Ilkhatal-Hevian War and the Second Shadow War. We're all hurting. We're all exhausted and afraid. But publicly tarring and feathering Kingsley and then hanging him when no one else is being held accountable won't fix anything. It won't end Ilkhatal or demon nationalism. It will only fuel it. If Kingsley is sentenced only to life imprisonment, it won't change his behavior, and it won't undo the harm he's caused. The forces that make all of our suffering possible must be ripped out by the roots. And the only way to do that is to challenge our entire mindset about the principles our current world is built on. I have no love left for Kingsley, but I don't want to see him martyred to salvage Hevian's wounded pride or to placate the Adrakanai's delusion that it will spark a Trosnik reawakening. After fighting with Siegfried and Marcus, I don't believe in martyrdom anymore. I want to live in a world where martyrs are no longer needed. And that starts by acknowledging and addressing the pain that has been and still is being inflicted, not exasperating it. Thank you, Senator. That was moving and thoughtful. Unfortunately, we're out of time for today's segment. I hope you will join us soon so we can continue this conversation. I'll keep returning until you tire of me.
You just heard Senator Tossier. People always ask, why are you Ilkhatal so violent? No one ever asks, why is the state violent? From Say I Sue Them Not by Kingsley Montevello. Tonight's episode was sponsored by Billy's Tattoo, Piercing and Carving Parlor, a parlor dedicated to making everyone beautiful. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky at Frederian Gazette, and go to our website, www.thefrederiangazette.com, for episode extras. Please join us next Wednesday at 5 p.m. for episode 17. Bear Castle police reopen investigation into officers' conduct during Siegfried's Day and determine their officers acted appropriately.